What if the final speech of John F. Kennedy was never meant to be heard by the public? Behind the scenes, pages disappeared, tapes were wiped, and secret directives erased all traces of a message so dangerous it threatened to unravel reality itself. Kennedy's late-night dictations hinted at a vision that challenged time, power, and perception, a vision that his closest aides tried desperately to hide. An underground network worked tirelessly to suppress what could have changed the course of history forever. Whistleblowers vanished, researchers were silenced, and fragments of the lost speech continue to surface only to disappear again. This is not just a story of conspiracy. It is a glimpse into a hidden war fought over the very fabric of truth. What did Kennedy know? And why was his voice silenced so completely? The answers lie buried in shadows, and the truth might still be waiting to be heard. Stay with us and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Washington, spring of 1963. The White House was unusually quiet that week. Behind the facade of routine press conferences and public handshakes, something was unfolding, something that even the president's closest advisors didn't fully understand. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, had begun a series of private dictations late at night, refusing stenographers and requesting only a reel-to-reel recorder and a locked drawer. These sessions took place not in the Oval Office, but in a lesser-known study near the Treaty Room, soundproofed and closed to all staff. The transcripts of these dictations were never archived through official channels. Instead, carbon copies were handed over to one man, Richard Goodwin, special counsel, and one of the few Kennedy trusted without question. But what truly raises alarm is what happened after Kennedy's death. Only a fraction of these documents ever surfaced, and within a week of the assassination, the White House Records Office flagged one internal memo, code-marked Case 802, as missing. Missing not as in misfiled, but physically removed, erased, traced, sealed. All references to Case 802 were systematically blacked out from security logs by December of 1963. No one could explain what it was. No official speechwriter had it. No archivist could find it. Yet several lines from those lost pages were reportedly quoted verbatim by an agent of the Defense Intelligence Agency during a closed congressional hearing in the spring of 1974. To understand what Case 802 might have contained, we have to go back not just to the presidency of John F. Kennedy, but to a moment that rewired the trajectory of his administration. June 11th, 1963. That night, JFK delivered one of the most radical presidential addresses in American history. His civil rights speech, televised from the Oval Office, less than 24 hours after the University of Alabama desegregation standoff. The speech was short, just under 11 minutes, but its impact was nuclear. It shook the status quo, split the Democratic Party, and left his own advisors reeling. What the public didn't see, and what was meticulously redacted from all preparatory notes, was that the original draft was nearly 3 times longer and contained an entirely separate section that no one could explain. That draft was labeled Version D8 and included repeated references to a theoretical concept Kennedy described as chronological leakage, the idea, mentioned obliquely, that the current crisis was not just historical, but echoed from a precipice that has not yet arrived. No one in the speechwriting team could trace the origin of the phrase. Ted Sorensen denied writing it. Arthur Schlesinger called it a haunting passage totally foreign to Kennedy's public vocabulary. According to one internal memo, declassified only in 2011, this section was the subject of a heated closed-door conversation between JFK and then CIA Director John McCone, who strongly advised the president to remove it, not because it was dangerous politically, but because, in McCone's words, "You do not repeat what came through you when you were under." This comment raised immediate red flags for the National Security Council's Psychological Analysis Unit. The phrase, "when you were under," became a subject of internal investigation. What was Kennedy under? Hypnosis? Chemical influence? Some form of cognitive experiment? Or something else entirely? None of these questions were ever answered. The only paper trail that hinted at the source of these words led to a suppressed transcript marked 802 Elthru, which disappeared less than a week after Kennedy's death. The very existence of 802 Elthru is disputed by most official channels, yet fragments of it were cited in a debriefing by Colonel Edwin Lansdale, an unconventional military figure deeply embedded in Cold War PSYOPs operations, and one of the few men with unrestricted access to both Kennedy and Allen Dulles. Lansdale, known for blending psychological warfare with unconventional diplomacy, allegedly received a copy of Al-Lit, not from the White House, but from a courier attached to the Office of Naval Intelligence. The courier, who disappeared from all public record in the spring of 1964, delivered the document wrapped inside a naval strategy file, sealed under the classification code Lucid Vault Level Red. According to Lansdale's own notebooks, now held in a locked archive at the Hoover Institution, this version of the speech contained a 4-paragraph reflection by Kennedy on the nature of time, specifically the lines, "We think we move through history, but it is history that moves through us. If we do not act in this hour, it may not come again, and the next voice you hear may not be mine." These lines do not appear in any recorded speech, draft, or memo available to presidential libraries or the National Archives. Yet 3 separate intelligence analysts, all retired by the late 70s, confirmed under anonymity to a Washington Post journalist in 1983 that they had seen the tape where Kennedy rehearsed these lines and that it was never supposed to be broadcast. Even stranger is the memo trail that followed. Within 48 hours of Kennedy's assassination, a classified directive, code-marked NSAMT 802, was issued to a closed circle of DoD and CIA officials. The order was short: purge all fragments under 802 chain. Duplicates must not exist. Auditory carriers to be magnetically wiped. There is no known authorization from LBJ for this purge. In fact, when the Church Committee probed suppressed documents in 1975, they identified this directive, but were blocked from accessing the underlying material. Senator Frank Church called it the Ghost Protocol, the only known black order never assigned to any sitting president, yet enforced as law across 3 agencies. That directive has never been repealed. It is still active today. Now ask yourself, what was on those missing pages, and why was it so critical to erase them, not just from paper, but from tape, transcript, and even memory itself? The mystery deepens when we examine what happened to the physical tapes recorded by Kennedy in his final year. Contrary to popular belief, the White House taping system was not invented by Nixon. It existed in a rudimentary form as early as the Eisenhower administration and was quietly expanded under JFK in early 1962. What few people know is that Kennedy installed a second, completely independent recording system in the treaty room's private study, operated not by the Secret Service, but by a shadow team from the Naval Photographic Intelligence Center. The existence of this secondary system, codenamed Bellatrix, was revealed only once, during a posthumous investigation into a destroyed archive at Fort Belvoir in 1979. That system recorded at a slower speed, captured broader frequency ranges, and operated 24 hours a day when Kennedy was in residence. None of those tapes were logged. None were archived. All were physically removed by naval operatives the night of November 22nd, 1963, within 4 hours of the Dallas assassination. According to a restricted inventory filed months later, the entire Bellatrix cache consisted of 37 reels. Only 3 have ever been recovered. One of them was found in a mislabeled case during the Reagan administration, inside a shipment meant for microfilm disposal. It contained no audio, only static, except for a single anomaly. A voice print signature confirmed by 3 independent labs as belonging to JFK. Uttering the phrase, "They are not ready to hear this. If you are, burn this." No one has ever explained why Kennedy would issue such a message on a secured channel, known only to 4 people. The forensic metadata from the tape, analyzed in 2004 by the National Security Archive, revealed the recording was made between 2:07 and 2:14 a.m. on October the 30th, 1963. That date is critical. Not only was it less than a month before his death, but it also coincides with the only known time JFK was unaccounted for in his official calendar. From 10:00 p.m., October 29th, to 6:00 a.m. October 30th, Kennedy vanished from all logs. No Marine Guard saw him. No phone calls were made. The motorcade remained idle. But satellite logs from the Naval Intelligence Operations Center show that an unmarked helicopter lifted off from the White House South Lawn at 10:41 p.m. and returned just before dawn. Where did he go? What did he see? And what was said or shown to him that triggered a message warning future listeners to destroy the evidence? We are now entering the void where history ceases to be linear and starts to bend. To fully grasp the implications of what Kennedy might have encountered that October night, we must follow the trace elements left not in traditional archives, but in the margins of unrelated intelligence briefings, specifically a declassified 49-page report from the Advanced Theoretical Studies Group at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, dated October 31st, 1963. The report, classified beyond top secret, was not addressed to Kennedy directly. It was intended for internal review within the Defense Intelligence Agency, yet a handwritten note on the final page reads, "Brief POTUS personally, 10:31, before NSC session." The signature is illegible, but the ink has been matched to pens used only in the West Wing. The content of that report is unlike anything else produced during the Cold War. It references phenomena labeled as extrachronal harmonics, information recursion anomalies, and most chillingly, a causality inversion event detected at fixed coordinates near Mount Weather, Virginia. For those unaware, Mount Weather is not simply a FEMA operations hub. It is a subterranean complex with roots in Eisenhower-era continuity of government planning, linked by tunnel to D.C., and frequently mentioned in conspiracy circles as the fallback control center in the event of nuclear war. But what Kennedy allegedly received that night, according to fragments of the Bellatrix metadata logs and a surviving field report by a junior analyst named Michael R. Clement, was not a security briefing. It was a demonstration. Clement, who later disappeared during the Laos conflict, left behind a personal notebook which survived via his family. In one entry dated November 2nd, he describes seeing an event playback, a simulation that bent our internal clocks. It was shown to the president. He was changed after that. The word playback is curious. Several cross-references point to a rumored protocol called the Time Window Initiative, a theoretical program attempting to model future civilizational trajectories based on extreme variable simulation, using early quantum computers and physiological feedback loops from select test subjects. The purpose? To preview national fate options, a phrase pulled from an NSA glossary uncovered decades later. In essence, Kennedy may have been shown not a document, but a projection, a version of the near future, a world that might unfold depending on choices made now. What he saw, what he heard, was never recorded in standard language. Yet the disappearance of 802 ILT-3 and the radical tonal shift in Kennedy's unscheduled late-night dictations from November 1st to November 15th suggest he experienced something profound enough to rewrite the way he viewed the presidency, power, and the future of humanity. That shift cost him more than peace of mind. It may have cost him control of his own administration and ultimately his life. There's one speech Kennedy planned that was never delivered, scheduled for November 29th, 1963, at the Dallas Trade Mart. The prepared remarks, released posthumously by the White House, were a typical combination of optimism, policy, and Cold War rhetoric. But according to a memo from Pierre Salinger, then Kennedy's press secretary, the president had instructed speechwriters to scrap the third section and insert the real message just days before the trip. That version was never seen again. What's particularly chilling is that a man named Roger Hilsman, then director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, later claimed in a 1972 closed interview with the Rockefeller Commission that the real speech contained coded references to irreversible systemic decay and the urgent necessity for non-linear governance. He went further, stating Kennedy wanted to announce the establishment of an interdisciplinary task force to investigate temporal disjunctions, a phrase that doesn't appear anywhere else in federal language before or since. What Hilsman revealed is that Kennedy had become fixated on a singular idea in the last weeks of his life, that America's path was not just a political or economic trajectory, but a metaphysical one, that events were beginning to repeat or echo out of sequence. Staffers reported him speaking in what they called loops, asking the same philosophical questions at the same time of night for several days in a row. "What do you do?" he asked one aide, "if you realize you're inside the answer?" In the now infamous private meeting with NASA Administrator James Webb on November 12th, Kennedy pushed for a total reclassification of cosmic anomalous signals received during Project Ranger. The transcript reveals Kennedy asked Webb whether, "We've considered that our observers may be watching from the wrong side of the equation." Webb responded by ending the meeting and classifying the recording. But perhaps the most undeniable trace of Kennedy's psychological state comes from White House physician Dr. Janet Travel, known for treating Kennedy's chronic back pain. She kept private medical notes detailing unusual behavior in her patient. On November 14th, she recorded Kennedy requesting sedatives to delay REM onset. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Because I'm not sure it's me who wakes up anymore." By this point, Kennedy was surrounded not by political allies, but by men who viewed his philosophical shift as a threat. His resistance to standard Cold War doctrine, his attempt to redefine the very nature of national security, and his obsession with unseen variables drew concern from the Joint Chiefs. General Curtis LeMay called Kennedy an existential liability in a private conversation logged in the Pentagon's clandestine communications archives. Kennedy's growing detachment from realpolitik and embrace of what he reportedly called deep logic marked him for isolation and removal. We are no longer talking about history. We are speaking of something far more dangerous: suppressed reality. In the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, while the country was mourning and television networks replayed the Zapruder footage on loop, a far quieter operation was unfolding behind the scenes, one that involved no public ceremony, no flag-draped casket, no rifle salute. This was the silent obliteration of any trace of Case 802. Between November 23rd and December 5th, 1963, 17 separate White House archival containers were reassigned, redirected, or reclassified under emergency security provisions. These boxes, originally marked for the Kennedy Library, were instead routed through Andrews Air Force Base to a subterranean storage wing of the National Photographic Interpretation Center. Among them, according to later FOIA requests, were several unmarked vinyl folders containing partial speech manuscripts, dictated fragments, and tape-to-type translations of unknown source. Yet all tracking information vanished after December 12th. The manifest codes were erased manually, not by clerical error, but by direct override from a high-level NSA terminal operating under a false administrative ID, now believed to have been linked to a project known only as Archive. The Archive operation appears only once in federal documentation, within a redacted paragraph from a 1965 internal CIA communication referencing deep structure informational pathways incompatible with public domain governance models. The note ends with a directive: maintain integrity of Case 802. Full public release deemed catastrophic to state function. This is the language of quiet panic. We're not talking about a speech here. We're talking about something that fundamentally contradicted what government is allowed to acknowledge. Something Kennedy was preparing to name in front of the American public. Something so destabilizing that even the shadow mechanisms of government, typically fractured and competitive, moved in perfect coordination to stop it. And yet, despite the purge, faint echoes remain. In 1991, a janitor named Russell Thompson, working at the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building, discovered a crushed tape reel wedged behind a false panel in an unused storage locker. The reel was turned over to a private collector who had it restored at a university audio lab in Vermont. The contents? 15 seconds of muffled speech with 3 words, audible: history breathes backward. Voice recognition software matched it to JFK's recorded cadence with 98% certainty. The reel was stolen from the lab 3 days later, never recovered. But the waveform analysis survives, and with it, the fingerprint of a message someone wanted to erase so thoroughly that even accidental survivors were hunted. The reaction to these fragments, their systematic suppression, not once but over decades, tells us far more than the content itself. It tells us that someone, somewhere, believes the American public must never hear what Kennedy intended to say. And that belief has governed policy more than any election or legislative act ever could. If we follow the surviving trail of fragments, There's one name that surfaces more than any other in relation to the Kennedy disappearance materials: Dr. Leon Thurwell, a cognitive theorist and linguistic cryptanalyst under contract with the NSA between 1959 and 1965. Thurwell's name appears in marginalia across multiple declassified internal memoranda, usually next to redacted keywords or cipher formulas. What makes him particularly relevant is that, in a confidential letter to MIT's Department of Linguistics, later unearthed by author Jim Hoogan, Thurwell stated, "The president's missing pages describe more than a prediction. They outline a feedback loop of perception, a recursive event in which collective observation alters the timeline of its own recording." In layman's terms, he implied that Kennedy wasn't just going to talk about the future. He was going to speak something into it. Thurwell claimed that this was not metaphor, it was structural, that the missing text was written with an internal linguistic formula capable of embedding command phrases across multiple interpretation levels, subtle instructions encoded into syntax itself, understandable not consciously but unconsciously by a mass audience. He referred to it as operational resonance. This idea that speech could carry not just content, but command beneath the level of cognition is not science fiction. Projects like MKUltra, Artichoke, and Monarch all explored how suggestion, when embedded through tone, rhythm, and linguistic patterning, could bypass rational filters and affect behavior. But Thurwell's claim went further. He argued that Kennedy's intended message, the real speech, was a form of event catalyst, something designed to break the inertia of what he called static consensus reality. It would not have been like any other speech. It would have functioned more like a trigger, a key turning in a lock already buried in the architecture of belief. Thurwell vanished in February 1965, just weeks before he was scheduled to speak at a classified think tank symposium on semantic weaponization. His last known appearance was in a grainy security photo entering the Federal Records Center in Suitland, Maryland. He never exited. Internal security logs for that day were later corrupted, and no investigation was pursued. His office was cleared within 72 hours, his research sealed under a 25-year restriction that was extended twice, most recently in 2015. If this man was merely speculating about rhetorical structure, why was he treated as a state-level threat? Why were his notebooks locked behind doors requiring biometric clearance levels granted only to 3 living personnel? And why did a copy of Kennedy's alleged pre-speech resonance draft, marked 802V in pencil, appear in Thurwell's login box 3 days before his disappearance? We are no longer dealing with politics. We are approaching something closer to cognitive warfare. To grasp the full scale of what Kennedy may have intended with Case 802, we need to look beyond the speech and into the architecture surrounding it, the logistical choreography of what was to be its delivery. In the week before his scheduled appearance at the Dallas Trade Mart, a string of unusual orders were issued from multiple federal departments under the vague cover of event coordination. These included an unexplained military rerouting of aerial surveillance over central Texas, a temporary blackout of UHF frequency bands between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on November the 22nd, and, most telling, a classified directive from the FCC to temporarily deactivate a new VLF transmitter site near Denton, Texas. This VLF installation, still in trial phase, was part of Project Sanguine, an experimental submarine communication system that also had anomalous secondary capabilities related to atmospheric signal propagation. Why shut it down during a civilian presidential address? The timing was not random. Internal NASA flight path logs show that at precisely the moment Kennedy would have been concluding his speech, 12:39 p.m. Central Time, an unmanned surveillance balloon launched from White Sands was scheduled to pass directly over Dallas airspace, trailing a payload containing a suite of electromagnetic mapping devices designed to capture subharmonic fluctuations in mass audiences. In simpler terms, the government wasn't just tracking crowds. It was listening for something else, some reaction not measured in applause or protest, but in frequency shifts, bioelectric responses, ambient resonance. Why would such infrastructure be in place for what was publicly billed as a simple address to Texas business leaders? Because it wasn't simple. According to a heavily redacted internal Joint Communications Command memo obtained through a 2012 FOIA lawsuit, the broadcast of Kennedy's speech was scheduled to be dual-tracked, one line feeding standard media outlets, another routed through classified signal hubs and rerouted via secure nodes to Langley, Fort Detrick, and the Strategic Air Command. The purpose: real-time analysis of field effect patterns under live executive delivery. This phrase, field effect patterns, has no precedent in any broadcast protocol before or since. It is a term borrowed from particle physics, not telecommunications. Only one conclusion makes sense. The government was preparing for Kennedy to initiate something that was not merely rhetorical or symbolic, but experimental in nature. A signal, a pattern, a rupture. Yet we know what happened instead. The speech was never delivered, the signal never broadcast, and every piece of that infrastructure, every recording node, every backup frequency, every logbook was wiped within 48 hours. Not misplaced, not archived, wiped. Ask yourself, what kind of message could require such a stage? And what kind of fear makes the entire apparatus of the state collapse it before it's heard? To unravel the final threads of Case 802, we must confront the figure most deeply entangled in its erasure, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Upon assuming the presidency, Johnson moved with unprecedented speed to secure, isolate, and suppress all materials related to Kennedy's unscheduled projects. Within 72 hours of the assassination, Johnson signed Executive Directive 9031, a non-publicized emergency classification act, allowing for indefinite control over all speech drafts, audio materials, and transcriptions deemed non-continuous with standard policy. This directive was never reviewed by Congress. It never appeared in the Federal Register. It was activated in a secure room at the Naval Observatory, witnessed by 2 NSA legal officers and 1 unknown civilian, whose name remains redacted in every related document. But Johnson didn't stop with legal instruments. He dismantled the physical apparatus of Kennedy's research initiatives. The White House speech offices and private annex, where 802L3 was rumored to be stored, was quietly gutted and reassigned to a task force on domestic communications streamlining. All staff members associated with Kennedy's special speech team were reassigned, demoted, or placed on extended leave within 3 weeks. One of them, a junior researcher named Evelyn Markham, disappeared entirely. Her personnel file was sealed. Her apartment was found vacated, scrubbed of all records, with only a single item left behind, a torn index card reading, "If the voice returns, don't answer." Markham had last been seen at a secure speech drafting facility in Reston, Virginia, carrying a black folio case that allegedly contained carbon fragments of the 802 materials. According to an anonymous DIA whistleblower in 1989, those fragments were collected by military operatives posing as Secret Service agents and transported not to the National Archives, but to a subterranean wing of the Defense Technical Information Center, where, in his words, all speech becomes signal, and all signal becomes silence. That phrase would later be linked to an internal CIA psychological operations manual titled Voice Nullification Protocols, designed to eliminate traces of unsanctioned narrative structures from public memory. But the most damning evidence of Johnson's involvement comes from a series of wiretap transcripts, illegally obtained by a contractor embedded at Bell Aerospace. In one recording, verified for voice authentication in 2004, Johnson is heard speaking to an unnamed naval officer. "We're past the damn moment now." He wanted to open the curtain, but hell, the stage wasn't built for what was behind it. You ever heard a country fall from a whisper? That's what that boy was gonna do. A country falling from a whisper. A sentence that encapsulates the true threat Kennedy posed, not to national security in the conventional sense, but to the agreed illusion on which all of it is built. He wasn't going to incite rebellion. He was going to disarm belief, publicly, irreversibly, and they couldn't let that happen. By the mid-70s, the whispers surrounding the lost speech had grown too loud to ignore. Independent journalists, rogue academics, and even former intelligence operatives began piecing together a mosaic from what had survived. Scattered phrases, suppressed memos, unreturned FOIA requests, and the telltale scars of state-level erasure. Among them was a little-known linguist and crypto-historian named Dr. Harold McAvoy, who published a brief monograph titled Recursive Resonance and the Presidential Voice in 1976. The paper argued that JFK's final undelivered address was not a mere text, but a semiotic rupture device, a deliberately structured linguistic sequence capable of dismantling belief systems encoded through cultural repetition. In plain terms, McAvoy believed Kennedy had devised a speech that would rewire the American perception of reality by speaking directly to the subconscious logic beneath national myths. The backlash was immediate. McAvoy lost tenure. His home was raided under tax fraud charges. His research was labeled linguistic pseudoscience. Yet 3 years later, a bootleg copy of his original notes surfaced through an anonymous microfilm dump in West Berlin. Inside was a transcription, partial, fragmented, of what McAvoy claimed to be Kennedy's final dictation, obtained from a retired CIA archivist turned whistleblower. It begins not with a greeting or a call to unity, but with a stark sentence. This is not the beginning, because beginnings are a lie we tell ourselves to escape the shape of the whole. The tone that follows is unlike any recorded Kennedy speech. It's intimate, circular, philosophical, at times even mystical, but it is not New Age. It is not dreamlike. It's mathematical in its construction, using mirrored sentence structures and internal echoes of phrases, forming a cadence that feels less like a man speaking and more like an equation revealing itself. The speech addresses not war, not civil rights, not the space race, but time, not as metaphor, but as architecture. It proposes that the American experiment has been hijacked, not by foreign adversaries, but by a structure of perception frozen in feedback. That political rhetoric, media saturation, and national memory have congealed into a system where no new future can emerge, and that the only path forward is to fracture the loop, publicly, collectively, and linguistically. If a people are trapped in the echo of their own declarations, Kennedy allegedly says, then the next war is not with bullets, but with meanings. McAvoy's source claimed the speech was never meant to be understood in one sitting. It was written like a sonic key, something that would burrow into the mind, lie dormant, then activate. Whether this was metaphor or literal design remains unknown, but what followed the release of this fragment was no coincidence. Within 5 months, McAvoy was dead. A supposed heart attack at 47. The microfilm vanished from circulation, and every known reference to his monograph was deleted from academic catalogs in the United States by 1982. And yet, pieces remain, in scattered hard drives, in suppressed archives, in memories of men too old to threaten. They whisper of a voice that nearly broke through, a truth that nearly became audible, a door that almost opened. The last piece of the puzzle lies not in documents or speeches, but in the aftermath, a subtle, almost invisible network of cultural amnesia that reshaped America's collective memory. Following Kennedy's death, there was a systematic campaign not only to erase the physical traces of Case 802, but also to control how history was told. Educational curricula were revised. Media outlets adopted strict editorial guidelines, limiting discussion of Kennedy's later philosophies. Even Hollywood productions shied away from any hint of the existential questions JFK was grappling with. The official narrative became a sanitized portrait: charismatic leader, tragic martyr, Cold War warrior. But beneath the surface, those closest to the truth struggled. Evelyn Markham's disappearance was not unique. Whistleblowers who hinted at the missing speech, linguistic researchers who suggested its existence, even journalists who probed too deeply, faced sudden career deaths, mysterious accidents, or forced exile. A shadow war was fought in archives, editorial offices, and behind closed doors in think tanks and government buildings. The goal: to keep the public from hearing the message Kennedy never got to deliver, a message that could unravel the very fabric of how society perceives time, memory, and power. In recent years, digital leaks and hacking groups have unearthed fragments, but these are quickly drowned by disinformation campaigns and algorithmic suppression. The American mind, conditioned by decades of narrative control, instinctively resists the disruptive knowledge embedded in the missing pages. Yet the question remains: what if the recursive resonance Kennedy sought to unleash is still dormant, waiting to be triggered? What if the country's fate depends not on policy or power, but on whether this lost voice can ever be heard again? The story of Case 802 is more than a secret lost in history. It is a warning encoded in silence, a fracture in the timeline that challenges everything America believes about its own past and future. And until we confront it, that silence will continue to shape us more than any speech ever could. You have just stepped through a door most were never meant to open. The voice of JFK's lost speech still lingers in the shadows. Will you listen when it calls again?